Do I need to turn the video on the second?
No, it's okay. Hello, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started in about 7 minutes at 7 p.m. I'm just starting the stream early, so if you're watching this after the fact, fast forward about 7 minutes. I'll be back. I don't know what that means. Lindsay keeps assuming that I know sign language. Also, I can't get into chat. It says it can't connect. So I have no idea what anybody says unless you relay it to me. Hi, Mom. Oh, if anybody's curious about our air conditioning, they found the leak this week that they couldn't find last week. It's a leak in the evaporator coil, which lives upstairs in the attic. So that has to be replaced, and that's going to happen on Monday, which is lucky because I'll be home that day.
Oh.
Because it's a holiday. Unfortunately, it's not a holiday for the air conditioning guys. That kind of sucks for them. But yeah, that's going to get fixed on Monday. They got our air conditioning working just for this week, so that's good. And it's going to be early in the morning, so I'm going to assume that you'll still be asleep. I'll try to intercept them at the door so they won't ring the doorbell. And they're going to be here for several hours. So it'll be an interesting day.
So they like, take it back there?
like 8:30. But that's the earliest time they had. I mean, I was hoping that it would get done this week, but since I'm off Mondays are okay. It's okay. The internet didn't hear that.
Dad said he did cook out
Oh,
because he had asked what was for supper, so I said hamburger helper with corn and bacon.
mm-hmm. Those bacon bits are good, huh? That's the bacon that spilled bacon juice all over my foot the other day, which was really fun. Is my Bible on that side of the table? No, there it is. It's in the middle of all our. They got a really awesome view of my shirt. My fantastic plaid shirt. Well, I can really tell my hair is thinning on this camera. It's a very edifying feeling.
You're starting to look more like your dad.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've seen where this is. I'm going to go bald like right here. That's going to happen.
For your own home.
Yeah. I'm going to have the horseshoe. Bald
Then I
like
can
that.
shave your whole head.
There will be a lot less of it to shave.
Your mom says get some wow shampoo.
Some wow shampoo. We'll have to look for that, I guess. I don't know anything about it. That's not what she means, and you know it. Okay. 7 o'clock. So last week we left off in Exodus 12 at verse 42, I want to say. Yeah. Which was the conclusion of the narrative part of the Passover. So that we covered last week the last like 3 plagues, which was the locust, the darkness, and then finally the destroyer that killed the firstborn. And we saw in the text that the destroyer was God. And we saw the narrative of how the Israelites were ordered to sacrifice the animals, put blood on the doorways, eat, prepared to leave, right? Don't save any of the sacrifice, be ready to get gone early in the morning. And then,
Ask for stuff.
they asked for stuff, which is going to come into the narrative later when they're building out the tabernacle. And then they basically got booted, right? And there was that reference to 600,000 soldiers on foot, plus the mixed multitude of what would be considered foreigners to the Israelites, plus, all of their families and animals and everything. And we talked about how there were different approaches to those numbers, where some people see it as a literary device that's expressing, how great their victory is over the Egyptians. Some people see it literally. Some people see that as a translation that could be translated some other way. We're not going to get into all that. But that's what you'll likely see, one of those 3 approaches if you research this. And there's people that have a high view of Scripture that take all 3. So, if you want to chalk this up to scriptural authority, there's people in all 3 camps that say they're upholding scriptural authority based on one of those readings. So that's not really something, that's not a hill to die on. Anyway, so after finishing the narrative of the Passover event, now we're coming to some regulations about the Passover event. And this feels like a total interruption in the story, right? Because for the rest of chapter 12 and the first part of chapter 13, we're going to get this section of laws and regulations about how they're supposed to celebrate the Passover and why, right? And this bothers people because they look at it and they say, that's not how I would write a historical narrative. That's not how I would write the story. I would finish the story and then talk about it later, but this wasn't written to us, right? So depending on how you view the authorship of the book, you'll either look at this as Moses taking a parenthesis, like a timeout, to say, now, by the way, you Israelites, this is why Passover is something that you celebrate. This is the lesson that you're supposed to learn from Passover. This is why you celebrate it, and this is why it's important, and etc. Or you'll look at it as an editor coming in later to link that event and go, hey, listen, you Israelites, remember this thing that Moses did? This is why it's important. This is why that kind of thing, right? And again, there's people on both sides of that have a high view of Scripture. You can basically ignore the people that see this as proof that Moses couldn't possibly have written it, because that's some dramatic overstatement and isn't really borne out by the text. Anyway, so getting into chapter 12, verse 42. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, this is the statute of the Passover. No foreigner may eat it, but any slave a man has purchased may eat it after you have him circumcised. I reversed the word order there. After you have circumcised him, same thing. A temporary resident or a hired hand may not eat the Passover. In other words, this is something for God's people, right? Like a temporary resident can become a permanent resident. A foreigner can become a member of Israel. They have to join the covenant, right? So this is about God's provision for his people and a miraculous salvation, a miraculous rescue, right? It's for them, not for everybody else. Okay. 46. It is to be eaten in one house. You may not take any of the meat outside the house, and you may not break any of its bones. This is going to, of course, be referenced later on when we talk about the crucifixion, right? Because who was the Passover lamb? Christ. And were any of his bones broken? Exactly. The whole community of Israel must celebrate it. If a foreigner resides with you and wants to celebrate the Lord's Passover, every male in his household must be circumcised, and then he may participate. He will become like a native of the land, but no uncircumcised person may eat it. The same law will apply to both the native and the foreigner who resides among you. This is, of course, restating, if you want to participate, you have to be part of the covenant, right?
It's also interesting that it was like everybody in the household has to.
Mm-hmm. So in that culture, a house is collective, right? Like the head of the household decides for the household what side they're on, you know? So the other thing to look at is this is about identifying, choosing to be with God's people. Does that make sense? So they can't forcibly circumcise the foreigner and then, you know, cause him to be part of this. He's got to choose. And if an Israelite doesn't celebrate it, what is he choosing? Right? If this event is to be like a foundational touchstone for the Israelites, for the whole history, and a group of Israelites decides, you know what, that Passover thing, that's not really that important to me. I don't care. I don't remember what it's about anyway. F it, I'm done. I'm not celebrating that. Then what's going to happen? Like, what choice does that signify? That signifies choosing to identify with not God's people. Make sense? So that's why this is such a heavy-duty law, and it's so specific and hardcore in the way that it's talked about and enforced. 49. The same law will... the other thing, the end of 49, the same law will apply both to the native and the foreigner who resides among you. So this is something that we got into a lot when we were covering Romans, when it was talking about Gentiles and Jews both being saved by grace, right? So what identified somebody as an Israelite was their adherence to the covenant. What identifies somebody as a Christian is their adherence to the new covenant, right? So whether they started out as a genealogical offspring of Jacob, or whether they were a foreigner who was later grafted in, didn't matter. The covenant was open to everybody, right? They had to choose to be part of it, and they had to be circumcised to observe it. But it wasn't something that was genealogically restricted.
Mhm.
That ends up being important later on in the New Testament, of course. Okay, 50. Then all the Israelites did this. They did just as the Lord had commanded Moses and Aaron. On the same day, the Lord brought the Israelites out of Egypt according to their divisions. And there it is, another example of that militaristic language. And if you recall, one of the three interpretations of the 600,000 number was the idea that the word thousand could actually be interpreted as cohorts or groups of soldiers, right? So they would look at this according to their divisions as evidence to support that interpretation. 13. The Lord spoke to Moses, "Consecrate every firstborn male to me, the firstborn from every womb among the Israelites, both man and domestic animal, is mine." Then Moses said to the people, "Remember this day when you came out of Egypt, out of the place of slavery, for the Lord brought you out of here by the strength of his hand. Nothing leavened may be eaten. Today in the month of Abib, you are leaving. When the Lord brings you into the land of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Hivites, and Jebusites, which he swore to your fathers that he would give you, a land flowing with milk and honey, you must carry out this ritual in this month. For 7 days you must eat unleavened bread, and on the seventh day there's to be a festival to the Lord. Unleavened bread is to be eaten for those 7 days. Nothing leavened may be found among you." I lost my spot. "Nothing leavened may be found among you, and no yeast may be found among you in all your territory. On that day, explain to your son, this is because of what the Lord did for me when I came out of Egypt. Let it serve as a sign for you on your hand and as a reminder on your forehead, so that the Lord's instruction may be in your mouth. For the Lord brought you out of Egypt with a strong hand. Keep this statute at its appointed time from year to year." So there's the explanation for why this matters. And as we kind of alluded to before, it's like a touchstone for their culture for the rest of their history. This is where we came from, right? Mm-hmm. And the teaching point there would be, we were in slavery, right? We were forced to work for people who worshiped other gods. And it wasn't through our own power and effort. It was through God's power and God's providence that we got out of there. Make sense? There's a little bit more in there, though, because it talks about this thing, a land flowing with milk and honey. So what was... This is a little bit of a rabbit trail, but I think it's useful for the symbolism that's going on here, right? When God put Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, did Adam and Eve have to work in order to eat, or were they provided for by the garden? God planted this garden and filled it with food, right? Mm-hmm. He filled it with, all kinds of fruit for them to eat so that they wouldn't starve. And of course it was watered so they could drink, right? And then a whole lot of backstory happens. Mm-hmm. And several times when God shows back up to talk to these people, to Abraham and his descendants, he shows up at trees. What does that remind you of? Gardens, where there's fruit. And of course, we're going to see that imagery get carried forward in the construction of the tabernacle and the temple, right? There's an Edenic theme that people are supposed to remember when they think about that. So he meets Abraham at an oak grove, several times, in fact. He meets Moses at the burning bush, which isn't a tree, but it's in the desert. What are you going to get? Mm-hmm. Right? And then he talks about this land flowing with milk and honey. It's a place that he promised to take them where they would be provided for. There's a little bit of that Eden thread in there, mm-hmm. right? There's a little bit of the idea of reestablishing this place where God could be with his people again, right? Mm-hmm. And that's kind of the gist and the point of a lot of the regulations that we're going to see throughout the rest of Exodus, because there is going to be regulations for building the place where God will be with his people, the tabernacle. of dwelling. That's what that means. And there's going to be regulations for how they're supposed to worship. And then, of course, you get Leviticus, which goes way further in that. So that's kind of where they're going, right? So keep that in the back of your mind. They're supposed to remember that they went from this place of slavery and bondage and suffering and labor into this place where God made provision for them, right? Flowing with milk and honey, and where they'll be able to dwell with their God and he'll tabernacle with them, right? There's a definite Edenic thread in that whole idea. Okay. 11. When the Lord brings you into the land of the Canaanites, as he swore to you and your fathers and gives it to you, you are present to the Lord every firstborn male of the womb. This actually is what we opened the chapter with, right? And this is another one of those things that feels a little bit interruptive. Like we started with dedicate every firstborn, and then we went off to, oh, this is the importance of the Passover celebration, and then we're going back to dedicating the firstborn, right? Well, why? It's kind of a literary feature in ancient Near Eastern literature to bookend important stuff, right?
Yeah.
So bookending it highlights the fact that that thing that was in the middle matters, right? It's very common in this kind of literature to put the most important thing, the climax of the story, in the middle. Yeah. And in modern writing, we tend to put it at the end, right? We tend to have all of the stuff build up to the most important part of the story, and then a short resolution, and then the story's over, right? Whereas in this style of writing, they tended to put stuff in the middle that was the biggest, most important point. So bookending the reasoning for the Passover celebration with this discussion of dedicating the firstborns kind of highlights the importance of the Passover celebration. Okay. Middle of 12? Yeah. All firstborn offspring of the livestock you own that are males will be the Lord's. You must redeem every firstborn of a donkey with a flock animal, but if you do not redeem it, break its neck. However, you must redeem every firstborn among your sons. In the future, when your son asks you, what does this mean? Say to him, by the strength of his hand, the Lord brought us out of Egypt, out of the place of slavery. When the Pharaoh stubbornly refused to let us go, the Lord killed every firstborn male in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of man to the firstborn of livestock. That is why I sacrifice to the Lord all the firstborn of the womb that are males, but I redeem all the firstborn of my sons. So let it be a sign on your hand and a symbol on your forehead. For the Lord brought us out of Egypt by the strength of his hand. All right. Now, just a straight through reading of that, it makes sense, right? The firstborn belong to the Lord. And the firstborn animals may be sacrificed. If they're flock animals, they can be redeemed in order to continue to be used if they're donkeys, pack animals. But sons must be redeemed, right? This is something that you might see on the internet at the center of a really silly argument about child sacrifice. And the argument goes like this. These people assume that the Israelites evolved in their religion from a primitive child sacrificing polytheism into a more enlightened monotheistic non-child sacrificing religion, right? So they look at the later regulations and preaching against child sacrifice, and they say, aha, they must have said that. They must have had prophets railing against sacrificing children because it was happening. Okay, I'll give you that one. We put out a speed limit sign because people speed, right? But then they go too far and they say, that must mean that it was acceptable. Well, no. If it was acceptable, the prophets wouldn't have railed against it, would they? Right? So then they retroject that assumption into passages like this And they say that the line about you must redeem your firstborn sons was added later, right? But that's called assuming what you need to prove. That's called circular reasoning, right? So there's no text that shows that. There's no text that we have that shows that, oh, you have to redeem your firstborn sons. Also, if that were the case, why'd they put in the thing about donkeys? Were the prophets really that worried about firstborn donkeys? Like, why does that matter, right? And how stupid would it be for God to say, all right, here's this thing that will identify you as my people, this sacrifice for the Passover, this tradition that you'll have for all time to save your firstborn sons. Now kill them all. Like, that's dumb.
Yeah.
Right? So they do have an animal sacrificial system where sacrificing herd animals, right, sheep and goats, is part of their worship for God, right? So it makes sense that the firstborn of the sheep and goats would be dedicated for the sacrificial worship to God in that way. But human beings are completely different. And there's just no evidence that this is a late addition in order to get rid of some previous kind of pagan and savage practice. There's just nothing to indicate that, right? Yes, we do have prophets railing against human sacrifice later on, but it's entirely reasonable that that came as sort of a pollution, an add-in from the cultures that they intermarried with that did have that practice as part of their religion in certain cases. And that's a whole nother ball of wax that I'm not prepared to talk about. But it's way, way too far to say that before the prophets fixed Exodus, that it was perfectly okay and acceptable to sacrifice your kids. That's stupid. Nevertheless, scholars have written lots of peer-reviewed work. Well, some scholars have written lots of peer-reviewed work about that. And that just goes to show that some of them are idiots.
That's how you really feel.
That's how I really feel. Anyway, now we get back to the narrative, right? 17. When Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them along the road to the land of the Philistines, even though it was nearby. For God said, the people will change their minds and return to Egypt if they face war. So he led the people around towards the Red Sea along the road of the wilderness. And we talk about this word that gets translated as red, right? It's actually the Sea of Reeds is what the word is, right? But it could also be voweled to mean this other thing, this Yam Suf, that was the border of Egypt that separated it from the wilderness, which was also a body of water. And we talked about this a little bit last week, how that body of water, because it divided Egypt from the wilderness, it was also thought of as the border between the good land where the Egyptians lived and the underworld, right? So whether you take this as Red Sea, Sea of Reeds, or this border of the underworld Yam Suf thing, that kind of affects what sort of theological stuff you might put into the rest of the narrative, right? Some people want to see a very naturalistic event that gets talked about in miraculous terms. I think that's missing the point, right? I favor the idea that this body of water represented the border between the land of the living and the land of the dead. And it makes some narrative theological sense, and we'll see that moving on. But just have that in the back of your mind, because you'll read this, of course, on the internet also. It's not the Red Sea, it's all garbage. No, it's not. That's a translation choice that some traditionalists made a long time ago.
Yeah.
Right? That doesn't mean that we scrap the entire story. Okay, so he led the people around towards the Red Sea along the road of the wilderness, and the Israelites left the land of Egypt in battle formation. Moses took the bones of Joseph with him because Joseph had made the Israelites swear a solemn oath, saying, God will certainly come to your aid. Then you must take my bones with you from this place. Because he wants to be with his people in God's land, right? They set out from Succoth and camped at Etham on the edge of the wilderness. The Lord went ahead of them in a pillar of cloud to lead them on their way during the day, and in a pillar of fire to give them light at night, so that they could travel day or night. The pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night never left its place in front of the people. Then the Lord spoke to Moses. Tell the Israelites to turn back and camp in front of Pi-hahiroth, between Migdol and the sea. Now, these places are not necessarily identifiable. That's the one thing I wanted to point out here. Many people have been trying to figure out for quite a long time exactly what route the Israelites took, and some of these places are just not identifiable, right? We know that they crossed the sea. We know that they end up in Canaan.
Yeah.
They end up at the mountain of God. They end up at Sinai at some point in the middle of that, right? And for 40 years, they're in the wilderness. But the specific crossing point is not identifiable. Between Migdol and the sea, you must camp in front of Baal Zephon, facing it by the sea. Pharaoh will say of the Israelites, they are wandering around the land in confusion. The wilderness has boxed them in. I will harden Pharaoh's heart so that he will pursue them. Then I will receive glory by means of Pharaoh and all his army, and the Egyptians will know that I am Yahweh. So the Israelites did this. Now remember what the point of dragging the 10 plagues out was to make an example of Pharaoh, right? And there's some theological baggage associated with that we talked about, but its importance is going to come up later on in the narrative as well. When we look at how, if you take a theological perspective of these events, the why everything happened and the what everything represents, then there's kind of a meta-narrative that all of this follows, right? So just a reminder that the point of these events, the way these are being interpreted for us by the writer, is that God is leading Pharaoh on in order to make an example of him, right? And in order to show who he is. 5. When the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, Pharaoh and his officials changed their minds about the people and said, "What have we done? We have released Israel from serving us." Yeah. Well, I read 4. Yeah. Okay, 6. So he got his chariot ready and took his troops with him. He took 600 of the best chariots and all the rest of the chariots of Egypt, with the officers in each one. The Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and he pursued the Israelites who were going out triumphantly. The Egyptians, all Pharaoh's horses and chariots, his horsemen and his army, chased after them and caught up with them as they camped by the sea beside Pi-hahiroth, in front of Baal Zephon. And these should be those are Canaanite sounding names, right? They're not Egyptian sounding names, but they're still within the land of Egypt. So how does that work out as far as identifying places? Kind of doesn't. As Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up and saw the Egyptians coming after them. Then the Israelites were terrified and cried out to the Lord for help. They said, this is actually kind of ironic. They said to Moses, is it because there are no graves in Egypt that you took us out to die in the wilderness? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Isn't this what we told you in Egypt? Leave us alone so that we may serve the Egyptians? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than die in the wilderness. Didn't they see all the stuff that God did? Didn't they see the 10 plagues? Didn't they see how they were protected from the 10 plagues, but the Egyptians were not? Right? This is kind of a constant factor that's going to be strung out through the rest of this narrative, right? That despite seeing over and over again proof that God is honoring his promises, they still don't believe, right? And we saw this referenced in Romans when Paul was talking about the Israelites rejecting the Messiah in his day, right? He quoted this story with God saying, I keep on reaching out to this people that keeps rejecting me. I believe his quote specifically was from Deuteronomy. It's talking about this, right? But Moses said to the people, don't be afraid, stand firm and see the Lord's salvation. He will provide for you today. For the Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You must be quiet. Yeah, that's a very poetic and diplomatic. Shut up, you idiots. The Lord said to Moses, why are you crying out to me? Tell the Israelites to break camp. Which is also kind of funny, right? I don't know. I find that kind of humorous.
What, that they were camped and
No. For the people to come to Moses and they're like, what did you do to us? You screwed us over. This is terrible. We told you this would happen. And Moses goes, sit down, shut up. God has this. And then he goes to God and God goes, why are you yelling at me? Didn't I tell you this was going to work out? I find that ironic.
Oh.
Okay, tell the Israelites to break camp. As for you, lift up your staff, stretch out your hand over the sea, and divide it so the Israelites can go through the sea on dry ground. I'm going to harden the hearts of the Egyptians, so they will go in after them. And I will receive glory by means of Pharaoh, all his army, and his chariots and horsemen. The Egyptians will know that I am Yahweh when I receive glory through the Pharaoh, his chariots, and all his horsemen. So he's going to receive glory through Pharaoh, his chariots, and all his horsemen. This is repeated for emphasis, right? Then the angel of God, who was going in front of the Israelite forces, moved and went behind them. The pillar of cloud moved from in front of them and stood behind them. Why is that said two different ways? It's almost like the pillar of cloud that was the presence of God and the angel of the Lord that was the human-shaped presence of God were both there, right? Again, this is one of those things that was part of the basis of a doctrine called the two powers in heaven, because until the 2nd century, when it sounded too much like Christianity, the Jews accepted the idea that God could appear as a man and still be God in heaven, right? Of course, they decided that that was heretical and stopped using it pretty quickly after the Christians started saying, see, Trinitarian thought works. Anyway. Okay, 20. It came between the Egyptian and Israelite forces. The cloud was there in the darkness, yet it lit up the night. So neither group came near the other all night long. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea. The Lord drove the sea back with a powerful east wind all night and turned the sea into dry land. So the waters were divided, and the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground, with the waters like a wall to them on their right and their left. The Egyptians set out in pursuit, all Pharaoh's horses, his chariots, and his horsemen, and went into the sea after them. Then during the morning watch, the Lord looked down on the Egyptian forces from the pillar of fire and cloud, and he threw them into confusion. He caused their chariot wheels to swerve and made them drive with difficulty. Let's get away from Israel, the Egyptians said, because Yahweh is fighting for them against Egypt. Fair point, right? Then the Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand over the sea so that the waters may come back over the Egyptians on their chariots and horsemen. So Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and at daybreak, the sea returned to its normal depth. While the Egyptians were trying to escape from it, the Lord threw them into the sea. The waters came back, covered the chariots and horsemen. The entire army of Pharaoh that had gone after them into the sea, none of them survived. But the Israelites had walked through the sea on dry ground, with the waters like a wall to them on their right and their left. That day the Lord saved Israel from the power of the Egyptians. And Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. When Israel saw the great power that the Lord used against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord and believed in him and in his servant Moses. Okay. One point of history. Critics of the Bible look at this story and say, wait a minute, we have all of the mummies from the time that we believe to be described historically in this period, and none of them died by drowning. I'm not sure how you can tell from mummy forensics whether or not they died of drowning, but that's what the claim is, right? But read it carefully. It says that Pharaoh's army and his horsemen and his chariots went in there. It doesn't say that Pharaoh went in there. Mm-hmm. So, according to the text, you don't have to have a drowned Pharaoh for this to have happened.
Yeah.
Right? But that's something that you might read on the internet. The other thing is, look at the way this sort of comes out. Look at the way this narrative resolves, right? We're going to have like a poetic interlude in chapter 15. So this is kind of a stopping point in the narrative. And we kind of alluded to this earlier in our study tonight. The Israelites started from slavery, right? God shows up in a manner that sort of recalls the promises of an Edenic restoration and says, hey, I'm taking my people out. You guys are coming with. You're getting out of here. You're going to the place where I'm going to be with you, right? Literally going to be with you, leading you through the desert, but I'm also going to put my dwelling with you and give you a tabernacle, and I'll live with you and provide for you in this land that I set aside for you. And they do it by going through a body of water that represents a transition from the land of the living to the land of the dead. Only they come out on the other side alive, right? The Egyptians, the enemies of God, do not, right? They chase them and they die. Yeah. They end up in the underworld, hell, dead, right?
That says, in Egypt at times when one pharaoh was overthrown, all physical reference was completely removed, so that could be what happened here.
Could be, right? My point there is just that from the text, we don't need a drowned pharaoh. So the lack of a historical drowned pharaoh, not a problem. But critics and detractors will make it a problem because they're trying to interpret the text in a way that suits them and their purpose to be critical of it, right?
Or they're trying to prove the Bible's wrong because there's nowhere in Egyptian history that the Pharaoh was drowned, so the Bible can't be true.
Exactly. So what they're doing is misinterpreting the text in order to define the battlefield that they're going to argue with, right? Well, why let them? It's not required of the text. The text doesn't demand anything like that. You know? And as Jim says, if they were embarrassed about that, why would they write it down? Mm-hmm. Right? Okay. So as we were saying, the symbolism here shows God's people passing through the underworld and the land of death and then out into the land of promise where God will dwell with them. And it shows God's enemies not, right? They pass into the underworld and die.
And he also says the great miracle is that the seabed was completely dry in that short of time.
Right. Because if it was a naturalistic thing, if it was just, this is something that I had heard talked about before where people would say like, oh, well, sometimes the wind blew on the Sea of Reeds and it pushed the water level down and you could wade across.
There's a note down at the bottom of mine that talks about one theory is that there was like the tsunami or something.
Right. So people try to come up with all kinds of mechanisms, right? Well, the only mechanism we're given is Moses raised his hand, God did a thing, and there was an east wind. And then it reversed, and then the Egyptians died, right? So what the text is trying to explain is definitely not an exhaustive description of how the Israelites crossed this body of water. We have very few details on that. Wind, dry ground, crossed. Egyptians didn't cross, died. What we do have, especially moving...
Egyptians that went in to get them.
Yeah.
Because I imagine there were probably enough that didn't cross that were like, whoa, not going there.
We don't know. Like, we don't know what proportion of the army, right? It says all Pharaoh's army, but earlier it said he took his best chariots, right? So we're led to believe that the entire contingent that followed them into the sea perished. But look at how the story is framed theologically, right? God's enemies get sent to hell, to the underworld. God's family passes through unscathed and goes off to the land of promise, right? Now, fast forward in your minds, but rewind in your thinking to when we started our study in Romans. And Paul talks about the gospel as this two-sided thing, right? The power of salvation for all who believe, but also God's judgment against the wicked who reject him, right? How there's restoration and resurrection, right? And how the new covenant, the believers identify with that covenant through baptism, which represents what? Going down into the water and coming back up. Wait a minute. It's like the symbolism kind of matches, isn't it? Right? So you think in your head, Paul, where the heck are you getting that? Well, Paul was a student of the Old Testament, not just of what it said, but of the symbolism that was associated with it, right? So this kind of pattern where through no effort of their own, but only through God's power, God's followers get provided for, protected, and preserved and restored, that carries forward through the rest of the book, right? And those themes are carried forward into apocalyptic writing in Revelation. And the themes of God's enemies being destroyed, right, and going into the underworld, that also gets carried forward, right? So I just wanted to point that out as like a theological framework to look at the story with, rather than trying to look at it from the perspective that we would write history in the 21st century, right? Because if you go on Wikipedia and you look up any historical event, you get different kinds of details, right? But the details that you get in this account have a different purpose, right? Like we saw it with the explanation of the Passover. This is an event, but it's framed in the narrative to remind the Israelites who their God is and why they worship him, right? And it's the same idea with a lot of the events of Exodus. Here's an event, and instead of getting exhausted about the methods and mechanisms and dates and locations, let's get exhaustive about what it means to the Israelites, right? Because being able to quote dates, times, places, all that kind of stuff is not really of that much value. They're not arguing about whether or not an event happened. They're arguing about what it means, right? Why did God do it? Why did God allow it? Why did God, do this instead of that? That's what we're really trying to get at through a lot of this stuff. So the argument about the historicity of the event is kind of missing the point. Make sense? So that's where we're going to wrap up for today. It was a little quick. But yeah, that's where we're going to wrap up. I don't think I could cover, the next 21 verses in 10 minutes. I'm pretty tired today anyway. So that's where we're going to end here. Big takeaways are the establishment of the Passover celebration as a memorial and a touchstone for their culture, to look back on the event as kind of the foundation, right? So that's a big part. A big takeaway is looking at the event through a theological lens, right? Why did God do it? Well, he did it to gain glory over Pharaoh. But also, and we can do this with the value of 2020 hindsight, right? Mm-hmm. Being able to look at that pattern and see what the thinking of later New Testament writers was tracking on when they framed the Gospels and when they framed epistles and apocalyptic literature, right? The restoration and resurrection of God's faithful and the punishment and destruction of those that hate God, right? And then the other big takeaway is don't let people define the playing field for interpreting the Bible badly and then force you into defending their bad interpretation, right? There's just no reason to allow that. Make sense? Mm-hmm. And that's where we're going to end for today. Let's go ahead and pray. Father, thank you again for taking care of us. Thank you again for providing for us, specifically for providing very effective and capable air conditioning technicians. It's Georgia. It's hot. I'm allowed to thank God for that. Thank you also for making space in your new covenant for people who were not Israelites by birth, but people who joined the covenant from outside, because that's all of us. Thank you for promising us a restoration for your people and a home and a destiny to look forward to. In Jesus' name, amen. And have a good night. I'll see you all later.